Okay, let's go. Let's get started with today's lecture on image processing. Here's what we're going to do. First of all, we remind ourselves as to what we have been doing last time. And yeah, we already began to discuss the idea of mesh warping. We'll look into that more closely today. And in particular, we'll meet yet another way of mapping quadrilaterals onto quadrilaterals. And once we have seen that, and I also should have had an application section here, I don't know why there isn't. We'll look into applications of that, and then we, after sort of we have familiarized ourselves a bit more closely with these ideas of warping based on quadrilaterals, we'll see that the technique we learned about last time is actually very interesting in the sense that it can be computed very efficiently. It is yet another separable operation. We'll look into that in more detail and then look at applications that are great fun in the sense of that we will understand ideas such as morphing and so on. And then we'll summarize and we're done for today. Let's get started. Last time we ended our lecture with looking at ways of how to map a certain quadrilateral to another one. I'm referring to figures like these, geometric forms like these, or like that, in the plane. So those are two-dimensional geometric forms. I refer to them as quadrilaterals because even though this is a perfect square, and this is, you know, it's not a trapezoid, it's not a rectangle or whatever. What is special about these figures is that they have 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices. 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices. Corners, you may want to call them. I call them vertices because those are convex sets. That is, you know, if you select two arbitrary points within this rectangle and draw a line between those points, this line will never leave this figure. That is what it means to be convex. And the extreme points of a convex set are called vertices, and there you have it. So quadrilaterals have 4 vertices. This is why we are talking about quadrilaterals. Now, we wanted to understand or be able to map this figure onto that one. In particular, what we are after is a mapping that would map this point onto this one, this point onto this one here, and this point onto this one. So the 4 vertices can easily be identified with one another. Right? Of course, I could have sort of like mapped this one here, but it doesn't really matter. We are interested in sort of a mapping of the vertices from this figure to that figure. That, here's another fancy term, preserves the topology. And that is to say, if we were to map this one here, this one there, then this edge would not have to be twisted or whatever. It would sort of be the same edge, at least conceptually. And yeah, while it's fairly straightforward to say that we may want to map this one here and so on and so forth, what about points on the inside of these figures? Right? Where would this point at coordinate u have to end up in this figure? And what we are looking after here is a mapping that maps this point onto this point. Here we basically know everything. We know the coordinates of this point. We know the coordinates of the vertices. Here, in this situation, look at the dashed lines there. It's a different kind of dashing than on the left-hand side. Here we only know sort of the locations of the vertices, and given the information that is available to us, everything here and the locations of the vertices over there, we want to figure out where this point will end up on the right-hand side. And here you go. That's the solution. Let me see if I have more. No. Okay. How do we do this? Basically, we know that this length here is to this length what this length is to that length. And given this simple information, we can basically compute the location of this point XA. We have the locations of these 2 points. Now we basically have to go from here to there, not the whole distance, but just a fraction of the distance, and this fraction is given by this ratio of 1 to u. And the same applies for that, well, this length is to this length, what this length is to that length, so we can also compute the location of that point xb. And now we can draw a line from xb to xa, and then repeat the trick where we say, okay, this length is to that length, what probably this length is to that length. And with these 3 equations, or these 3 pieces of information that we have, we can come up with this equation here. We did it in more detail last time, but this is basically the solution. If we know the values of u and v, that is, if we know this, and the other length are in this simple example 1 anyway, if we know those, we can plug them in at the corresponding locations in this equation and obtain the location of the point x in the quadrilateral on the right hand side. That would sort of be the location where this point u in the quadrilateral on the left hand side will end up. Just for the sake of the argument, what about if this was not the unit square? Would this work anyway? Could we compute something like this anyway? This is a fairly simple situation, right? Let's say if this figure was somewhere here and rotated a bit or so. Doesn't make a difference, right? We still assume that we know the locations of the vertices. If we know the locations of the vertices, we can still look at sort of like where would this point end up. We always have this length versus this length and so on. So that doesn't matter. This is just, you know, to convey this idea in a very simple setting. So here is an equation. It has a very peculiar form in the sense that this is not a linear equation, because the u and v have to be multiplied together at one place in this equation, and therefore it's a bit special. Nevertheless, we can rearrange this equation and write it down in terms of a matrix vector equation, where on the left-hand side we would have a 2-dimensional vector, and on the right-hand side we'd have a matrix times a 4-dimensional vector, where the entries of this vector are given by the factors that appear in this equation, right? And the last factor is 1. So there you have it. Now, and then by straightforward comparison or substitution, we could easily figure out what the meaning of these 8 matrix entries is, and there you have it. So this matrix here, this one, with 8 entries, can or is uniquely determined by the locations of the 4 vertices of the quadrilateral we want to map to. And note that they are called x11 and y11, and that is basically, if I go back here, the x11 is the x coordinate of this one, and y11 is the y coordinate of this one. These are vectors. The things in here are scalars. And then we already looked at some of the peculiar properties of these bilinear maps. Indeed, they are interesting and have some interesting characteristics. In particular, if we set these 2 entries to 0, then that would basically mean that this term here does not enter this equation anymore, and we would end up with just this. But this is what we met as an affine transformation much earlier on. So this bilinear transformation from one quadrilateral to another becomes an affine map depending on the values of these entries A and E. I said that horizontal and vertical lines will be mapped onto lines again. I said that ratios between distances, so we have a point here and a point there and a point there, and the say distance between this point to that one is to the distance of that point to this one. There is a certain ratio between these distances. These ratios will remain intact, not touched. They are invariants of these bilinear mappings. The crazy thing is that some of the diagonal lines we might find in a quadrilateral will become curves in the mapped quadrilateral. Here is an example. So first of all, here is a horizontal line, and well, you know, to us as sentient beings, it's obvious that this line is this line on the right-hand side of this figure, whereas this vertical line becomes this line on the right-hand side. We can see that. We are smart enough to figure that out. Let me single out a certain diagonal line, say from here to there. Looks very line-ish on the right-hand side as well. But if we look, say, at the diagonal from here to here, this is bent all of a sudden. And there's nothing we can do about it. This is just a property of this kind of transformation from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And when I say distances are preserved, then that means that this distance is to that distance, or this distance is to that distance. And we continued our study of these kind of mappings, I said, and I didn't actually show it to you, and I'm not going to show it to you today either, that if we compose two such mappings, say we go from here to there, and then there would be yet another quadrilateral, and we would map from this one to that one in the same manner, then the mapping from here to the third quadrilateral would not be bilinear, but it would be what we call biquadratic. And a very crucial property is that the inverse is also not a bilinear map. That is, if we want to go from here back to here, things are not as straightforward. So it's rather easy to map this one onto this figure. If we have figured out the transformation matrix that does that, then it is not so straightforward, just given this transformation matrix, to figure out the back transform. And this is of course because, look at this matrix, it is not a square matrix. Already tells us that this cannot be inverted right away. We looked into that in more detail last time, especially with respect to the x-coordinate. We can write down the equation with respect to x. Can also write down the equation with respect to y, solve for v, plug the solution for v in here, and then solve this one for u. With certain substitutions, we end up with this. So this is contains a solution to a quadratic equation, contains a square root, always something that is, well, square roots are certainly not a very difficult operation, but square roots are certainly not linear operations, and whenever we are dealing with situations where everything is linear, we know that we are dealing with a very manageable situation. So already the existence of the square root tells us it's not so manageable, and in addition we actually end up with two possible solutions for u, because we can either add this square root to this term in front of it, or we can subtract it. So there's actually two solutions for the u if we want to go back, and that tells us that this is not even, this inverse is not even unique. So somewhat of a special situation. In the situation we have been looking at, let me go back once more, even though it's lots of flickering here. We assumed that we know everything, in the sense that we know the locations of the 4 vertices on the left-hand side, and we know the locations of the 4 vertices on the right-hand side. Each of these vertices is a 2-dimensional point. If we identify this vertex with this one, that one, and so on, so we basically have 4 equations where we say this point here equals this one, some transformation applied to this point equals that one. This is the first equation, and we have that for the 3 other vertices as well. They are 2-dimensional points, so in a sense we have 8 equations. 4 vector equations, which if we look at them in terms of their components, become 8 equations. And indeed, again, back here, this matrix contains 8 unknowns. To us, they are not unknown, because if we know the locations of these things, we can compute them. What if we do not know the location of these things, but we would have to compute such a warp in a completely autonomous or automatic manner? It basically tells us that, well, either we provide our programs with all this information, or we have to add another block of code in front of the computation of these transformations, where these point correspondences are determined automatically. Right? Here we did it manually. We said there's 4 vertices on the left, 4 vertices on the right. But maybe we have a piece of code that finds points in an image, and not just one point, but say 4 points in one image and 4 other points in another image. Then we have to figure out which point corresponds to which, so relations between the points in the one image and the other image, because we need 4 correspondences in order to figure out the values of these 4 coefficients in that matrix. So we need 8 equations, and therefore we always need correspondences between at least 4 points in one image and 4 points in another image, or 4 coordinates in one image and 4 coordinates in another image. This would work if we had more correspondences. We would then have an overdetermined system of equations. It's not a problem, but we need at least 4 such points in order to have these 8 equations. Otherwise, problem cannot be solved. The map from the quadrilateral in one image to the quadrilateral in another image needs information as to 8 parameters. Yeah, and if we would have 4 points ui and 4 points xi, then once again we can identify them, and there are these 8 equations I've been talking about, and therefore, well, it is a good idea to have 4 point correspondences. Okay, that was about bilinear maps, and now we will look into something else, namely into the idea of projective maps between quadrilaterals. And on this slide, I am showing you 2 such quadrilaterals. Here is one, and there is another one. And if we were to know the 2-dimensional coordinates of the 4 vertices, we could immediately apply what we just discussed in order to compute a bilinear map from this one to that one. But there is another interpretation we may resort to if we look at this figure, and this additional interpretation provides us with an additional alternative approach towards mapping quadrilaterals. Can you already see what I am after here? Okay, the next slide will make it obvious. Look at this. we can think of this quadrilateral over here as the result of a transformation we would have applied to a, say in this case, rectangular piece, two-dimensional figure, rectangle, situated in 3 dimensions. And in particular, what I did to create these two quadrilaterals, I indeed had a little program that sort of located this two-dimensional figure in 3D space just as we see it here. And then I rotated this figure about this axis by a certain angle. Well, of course, my program did represent that in terms of a 3-dimensional object. And then I had to project it into 2D, and this is what I got. So, and that tells us that in addition to this idea of mapping figures like that onto figures like that in terms of bilinear transformations, we could also think about the transformation of this figure into that figure in terms of a perspective transformation. Right? And perspective or projective, this is, I'm using these two terms interchangeably, consists of 2 operations. The first one is we are given a point in 3D, and it is since we are interested in planar objects, so basically quadrilaterals, 2-dimensional quadrilaterals, can always think of them as basically being determined by their locations with respect to x and y, and then be situated at a z location which we may set to 1. And I actually did this in this figure here. And we would then have 4 3-dimensional points, and for each of these 3-dimensional points the z coordinate is 1. And we see this here, well, we see this here. This is one such 3-dimensional point, and the z coordinate is 1. So if we talk about projective mappings of 3-dimensional points like this, and the first thing we can think of is actually a transformation in that 3-dimensional space. These kind of transformations are realized by matrices like this, 3x3 matrices, in our case of points being embedded in a 3-dimensional space. And they produce a new 3-dimensional point, which I call u prime, v prime, w prime, because if we apply a matrix like this to a vector like that, then in the end this 1 here will not necessarily remain a 1. And this transformation would produce another 3-dimensional point. However, we are basically interested in 2-dimensional points, so we'd have to carry out a second operation that projects these 3-dimensional points into 2 dimensions, and this happens by means of normalizing the u prime and v prime, by this third coordinate. And those of you are taking courses in computer graphics, you should be well familiar with that. Note, however, that this v prime is entirely determined by the coefficient in this matrix and the u and v coordinate we are given. And indeed, this is what happened here. When I created this figure, where I represented this rectangle on the left-hand side in terms of a 3-dimensional object, where once again the z coordinate was set to 1 for all of the 4 vertices. Then, by rotating this figure about this axis, I basically applied a specific 3 by 3 matrix to this figure. And this produced a new figure where, of course, in 3D, this point will now probably be something larger than 1 along the z direction. But in order to map this back into 2D, and this is what the graphics program did for me when it created these 3-dimensional plots, of course, those are 2-dimensional figures, right? We cannot really, once we have holographic displays, we can really look at 3-dimensional plots, but this is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional situation. This matrix basically turned this object, and then by means of scaling, the figure became 2-dimensional again. There you have it. And yeah, without loss of generality, so you may have wondered why there is a 1 in here. Again, to those of you taking courses in computer graphics, this is not a magical occurrence. And we can set this 9th element of this 3 by 3 matrix to a value of 1 if there was another value, say I, some number I, different than 1. The effect of this value onto the transformation would be lost in this step anyway. If this was a number different than 1, this is basically geometrically means like some scaling along the z direction, but that scaling would be lost in this second step anyway. And therefore, in order to sort of simplify our lives, we can set this element of this perspective or projective transformation matrix to 1 without loss of generality. And this is what I just said. It's a scaling along the z-axis which will be lost after the projection anyway. So we have now 2 hammers in our hands. One is called bilinear mappings and the other one is called projective mappings. For the bilinear mappings we have already talked about their properties. Now let's look into properties of these projective transformations. Lines are mapped onto lines, and this holds for all the lines, if they are vertical or horizontal or diagonal. Here, lines will always be mapped onto lines. However, distances between points are not preserved, but they are warped perspectively. And all of this becomes clear from looking at this picture. So this line is mapped onto this line, this one onto this, and those are both lines here. Any diagonal in this image is mapped on a diagonal in this image, but the distance or the ratio of this distance to that one is not necessarily preserved. Right. In particular, note that distances between points become smaller in a sense. This is why this is projected. This is farther away. To our brains, this looks it's farther away. Right? Is a perspective mapping between these figures. Once again, if we want to determine the matrix that realizes this mapping from the coordinates of a certain point in one image to another point in another image, we need to determine 8 parameters. Right? The 9th one is set to 1 without loss of generality. That leaves us with 8 parameters, and that leads us back to the necessity to identify 4 points in the left image, or left image with 4 points in the right image. We need to have correspondences between 4 different points in order to be able to compute this matrix. And if we know those, we can indeed, by identifying points in the left and the right, end up with these equations that would tell us how to solve for x and y. And again, we would end up with 8 equations. And we can, again, write these 8 equations in terms of a matrix vector equation. And once again, the unknowns, basically, for us are the coefficients a, b, c, d, e, all the way through h that determine this perspective map. And here is this system of equations we need in order to solve for these, written down in a matrix vector equation. Interestingly, this is now an 8 by 8 matrix. It's square. Looks good in the sense of that this suggests that we can easily invert perspective or projective transformations. There's a difference between, a crucial difference between perspective and bilinear transformations. If you know 4 points given in coordinates u1 and v1 in one image, u2 and v2 and so on, and x1 and y1, and this tells you how you have to sort of like bring this information that is available to you together in order to determine the perspective map between 2 such quadrilaterals. Yeah, okay. Here is one caveat, and this is a funny one because it never occurred to me. But years and years and years ago, I was teaching a course on this, and students had to compute warps between images, and I said, okay, so we had written a little interface where they could place points in one image and place points in another image, and now they had 4 point correspondences and were supposed to compute the perspective transformation between the 2 images, and it didn't work. And the reason was that one of the teams, or those teams where it didn't work, the math figures out, but the problem was that they clicked at 4 points that lay along a line, 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, 4 points, so they were collinear. If those points are collinear, this doesn't work, because then basically you do not have enough information, because if they are collinear, then lots of these things actually end up with the same value, and you cannot solve for A to B. And that is if you manually identify 4 points in one image and 4 points in another image you want to map onto each other, they must not be collinear. That is, never provide your code with 4 points that lie along the line. Right? To your brain, those of course are, if there's a line in this image and it looks like this line in the other image, you can place 4 points and then they should, correspond to each other. This, for your brain, no problem. For the mathematics, it is a problem. So make them coplanar, that is more or less 4 points at the same depth. Your brain can figure that out, but not collinear. Okay. What is all of this good for? I said, you have 4 points in this image and 4 points in that image, and your brain can identify correspondences and provide your code with these correspondences, and you can map this quadrilateral onto this quadrilateral. Why would anybody ever care about this? Well, here are the standard applications of this idea of perspective or projective mappings between images. You can use that for texture mapping. I'll get back once we see an example of augmented reality. And it is also used for mosaicing, that is for stitching images together. We already talked about it, that modern cameras, if you take a couple of images in sequence, they magically create a larger image out of that. Let's have a look at the idea of augmented reality. And look at this. This is a scene. It's one of the floor my old university in Bielefeld, and they had lots of posters tacked to the walls. And roughly we can think of this huge piece of paper, of course, as a certain quadrilateral figure that has 4 vertices, right? We may not necessarily see them, but you know, they are there. And I can manually, this is what I did here, load this image with an image viewer and then move the mouse over here and determine the x and y or u and v coordinate of this point. I can do this for this point, and that point, so I can manually figure out the locations or coordinates of the 4 corner points of this poster. And we all are very familiar with the asterisk and obliques image by now. And of course we know the 4 corner points of this image. They are 0, 0, then some x length and some y length. It has a certain extension, right? So I can identify the 0, 0 coordinate in the asterisk and obliques image with this point. And I can identify the upper right corner of this image with this point, lower left corner with this point, lower right with this point. Now I have 4 point correspondences. I can determine the perspective map that would map the original asterisk and obliques image onto this mesh, onto this quadrilateral, apply the transformation to the image, and would get a result, and I can sort of put that result into this original image. Right? So I can artificially augment this picture of reality with content that has nothing to do with this reality. But perspectively, this is perfectly acceptable. The perspective here is correct. Right? Instead of, you know, mapping images into certain parts of a scene, you could have also done that with pieces of text or whatever. Right? But this is an example of what we call augmented reality. And again, those of you in computer graphics, there you may actually be dealing with problems where you would have to place 3-dimensional objects into the reality of a certain scene. But you know, see, even for image processing, we can deal with that. Right? Is there a problem with the image on the right-hand side? Something that feels not quite right? Is the illumination. Right? This is something we are not going to address in this course. We will talk about illumination in the next semester. But I can promise you that if I would have wanted to, which I did not want to in this case, but if I would have wanted to, I could have also continued processing this result such that, say, the image would have been slightly darker here or whatever. So I could have figured out the intensity or the local illumination in this image. We'll learn how to do that in the next semester, and applied this additional information to this artificially created image, and then that would even look more pleasing. Right? But here the bottom line is there is no problem whatsoever to put stuff into reality that is not really there. And once again, I said it before the holidays, this goes to tell you that never again in your lives should you ever completely trust any picture you see in any media. These days, in this day and age, we cannot naively believe that every picture we see shows reality as it is. What is reality is a philosophical problem anyway, but it is utterly trivial to tinker with reality, right? I said that this is also used in texture mapping. Now you can see, somehow see what I mean by that. Again, this is basically more or less a computer graphics problem. What we were dealing with here was an image, and we have a sort of easily identifiable quadrilateral. This is why I'm using this example, because the 4 vertices of this poster are really easy for me to identify, and it's a fun example. In computer graphics, you quite often deal with the situation that you have a 3-dimensional, say, wireframe model of some scene, some landscape. We already talked about computer games, so you have a 3-dimensional model of how the world you want to render is constructed. And yeah, usually you know, there has been a lot of progress, but basically the way these models, these wireframe models are generated is still very much in the sense that designers build those artificial worlds out of simple, convex, geometric, 3-dimensional geometric objects, like boxes and stuff. And by stacking boxes, you can create arcs and whatever. In a nutshell, in 3-dimensional representations of whatever worlds, you end up with lots of surfaces. You have this wireframe model of your world, and it is not textured yet. It just says, well, basically this table is a long surface, and now we have to somehow map something wooden onto that so that it looks like a table made out of wood. So you see that in computer graphics they have the problem of mapping images onto 3-dimensional wireframes. This is not exactly the problem we are dealing with here, but the mathematics they apply is exactly the same. Because they know the locations of these vertices in 3 dimensions, and now they have to perspectively distort a texture image, small images, and map it onto a certain 3-dimensional surface. So there you have it, right? And there you now already also see why it may be interesting for you as a computer gamer to adjust your graphics card settings. Right? I don't know what kind of interpolation I used here. It looks very blocky. It was maybe not by cubic spline interpolation, but to map this image into this subregion of this image, I first have to compute the transformation, and then I map every point, which requires to do some interpolation, and I obviously use a poor interpolation technique here, but the same applies for computer graphics. You have these 3-dimensional objects, just wireframes, and you want to map certain textures onto the surfaces of these objects. And this is the same problem, and they also have to consider interpolation so that it looks nice. And if they use bi-cubic spline interpolation, it gives you very aesthetically pleasing results, but has to do lots of computations. So there you have it. Augmented reality and computer graphics are very closely interlinked. Right. This was one application of perspective or projective mappings between quadrilaterals, and here's another one. I already said it like that. Modern cameras, you take a couple of pictures in a row, either in a slight arc like this, or just sort of slight linear displacement. Your camera is able to stitch them together into a larger image. Once again, I'm emphasizing that typically the images you take have to result from a slight rotation of your camera or a certain translation. Right. But not, you take one image like so and then the other like so. It's not totally arbitrary. That can be done these days as well, but that would require something way more elaborate than we're discussing here. And here is just an example of that. Those are 3 images, which again I took out of the window of my office in my old university, and basically I took one picture in this direction, then one in this direction, and one in this direction. So there is, we don't see it because, you know, all of these images are planar objects, but there was a slight rotation of the camera. And again, in creating the example that is to follow, what I did was I opened an image viewer, moved the mouse to this location in this image, figured out the x and y coordinates of this point, and I did it for 3 other points. So once again, there are certain landmarks here. Right? This is a building, some smallish high-riser, and there is a sort of corner here, which to me as a human observer is very salient, something that sticks out. This building here in this image is situated here, and we as human observers with sentient brains can easily figure out that this object in this image is this object in this image, and also sort of this corner in this image is located here, and in this image is located here. This is what is to say that it is salient, even though the image content as a whole has changed. We still are able to say that content-wise, what is realized by this corner is realized by this corner in this image. Right? And so, what I did is I determined the x and y coordinate of this corner in this image and of the corner in this image. And then I obviously did it for 3 other ones. Let's see if they are visible. And also probably it was like, I don't know, this one here and here. These image structures are easily, for us, can be easily redetected. So I figured out 4 points in the most image on the left-hand side and in the image in the middle. And I did the same for 4 points at sort of the right border of the image and 4 points the left border of the rightmost image. And note that these things are fairly warped. They are not perfectly square or perfect rectangle. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I have determined 4 points here and the corresponding 4 points there. I have determined 4 points here and the corresponding 4 points there. Now, this provides me with a way of mapping the content within this quadrilateral into this quadrilateral. There's a mapping from this figure to this figure. I can figure that out because we have now 4-point correspondences, gives us 8 equations, gives us solutions for the 8 parameters of the perspective transformation matrix. Once I have the transformation matrix, I apply it not just to the pixels inside this rectangle, but to all the pixels in this image. All right. And I have to do this once again. Have to determine the transformation matrix between this quadrilateral and this one. Can do it because there are 4-point correspondences. Once I have figured out the parameters of the transformation matrix, I apply the transformation to every pixel in this image. This image here is left untouched. No transformation is done with the image in the middle, but the 2 images, 2 outermost images, are being warped perspectively. And if we do that, we can easily determine, so okay, say where will the leftmost pixels in this image end up if we compute this warp. We can sort of predetermine the resulting coordinate. We can do that for the rightmost pixels, uppermost and lowermost pixels. So we basically, if we apply these transformations to these 2 images, we know how large the resulting mosaic has to be, because we know where sort of these extreme points will end up, and that gives us information as to how much memory we have to allocate in order to create a very large image. And this is the very large image. So basically, I can predetermine the locations of these points, and sort of I can predetermine the size of this thing. Once I have allocated that, we have mapped all the pixels to new coordinates anyway. Then I have to sort of map them into the coordinates of this new very large image. But all of this is not a problem. There you go. You can do that. And this is indeed exactly what modern cameras do. Right? This is so trivial, apparently, that it can be burned onto the chips of modern consumer cameras, and they can do it for you. I don't know, my little camera that has this thing, if I activate that function, I take a picture, then it shows me a rectangle and I have to move it, and so there is some trickery going on, but so this is sort of a guided mechanism for how to take suitable pictures for mosaicing. But there are really fantastic software packages out there. So if you take lots of pictures, throw them onto the hard drive of your computer, load them into some software package, Image Stitch is one, and then it figures out all the correspondences automatically. We'll learn how to do that in the next semester. And once you have all these correspondences, you can compute all these perspective transformations and stitch the images together, just as I've shown you here. Is there a problem with the result? Yeah, the black box, that is not really desirable. But here it is also very easy to determine sort of the largest rectangle that does not contain any black pixel. Well, there might be any black pixels in here, so what we could do is, I haven't done that here, but if I would ever to have to implement something like this on a product level of code, I wouldn't set these pixels to black, but I would come up with an internal format for image representation, probably set them to -1, right? And then I could determine the largest rectangle in here that does not contain any -1, so that is not of a big deal. This is actually, your cameras do that. Usually they don't have these black regions surrounding the image. They, of course, are there, right? Because we already discussed that if we compute transformations from one image to the other, it might be the case that we end up with a pixel coordinate that is outside of the original image. We don't know what to do there. We set, in this case, to black. That is not good. In fact, you cannot really see it on the projection. But do you see this line here? Yeah? And there is another one here. Why are they there? Yeah, this is because it is very hard to see for our visual system. But the illumination of this picture is ever so slightly different than the illumination in this picture. And if we just stitch them together geometrically, there will be these artifacts. And this is basically the same kind of artifact I already mentioned when I said this image warped onto the poster does not comply with the illumination in the original scene. I don't care here. This is not what we are studying right now, but let me tell you, it is no problem to automatically remove artifacts like this as well. We are not studying this right now, but in principle, no problem whatsoever. Right. So yeah, this can be done. And now that we have seen this, would you have an idea why, in order to create it, it has to be slightly rotated or shifted, but not sort of totally arbitrary? Would you know why we would require that for this simple approach here?
Distorted
Yeah, exactly. So this is mathematically not really necessary, but things are so much easier in practice if we sort of constrain the type of motion the camera can do. It has to be perspective. Right? And if we allow totally arbitrary orientations of the camera when taking lots of pictures, the distortions thought in terms of the perspective distortions between any two images might be too severe in order for the result to look pleasing to the human eye. Again, those are things that can be addressed, but not with this very rudimentary approach here. But this is basically the stuff your cameras do. And again, I mean, it's, you know, it is fascinating in a sense that there is, you know, no problem whatsoever. These things can be done without any problem these days. Actually, your camera does it for you. Okay, and now let's go back to the bilinear maps. The reason why I first talked about the bilinear maps, then about the perspective maps, and now back to the bilinear maps is the bilinear maps, in the way we talked about them, were very easy to understand because we just ever so briefly prior to that had talked about bilinear interpolation. Right? And these bilinear mappings between quadrilaterals is just a form of bilinear interpolation. And then I emphasized the importance of having 4-point correspondences. And this is, again, very beautifully illustrated in terms of these perspective warps. So we first talked about bilinear mappings because we already knew what that was. Then we moved on to perspective mappings because for the perspective mappings it's so beautiful to understand the need for 4 corresponding points. And now we go back to bilinear maps. And now we understand everything we need to know to understand the following. They have a very interesting property. I mean, they have this crazy property that certain lines are becoming curves and blah, blah, blah. But this is another instance of an operation that is separable. We already talked quite a lot about separability when we talked about image filters. Filtering with the Gaussian is a separable operation. You can first do it in x direction and then in y direction. We saw that the Fourier transform can be computed separable. That is, we first Fourier transform all the lines, rows of an image, and then the columns. Turns out that these bilinear warps between quadrilaterals are separable as well. Again, when I am talking about the warp function t, I am referring to some transformation of a vector that produces another vector, in our case 2-dimensional vectors. And yeah, this is not a matrix, so the transformation that turns this vector into this vector may do something with the u and v value of this vector to produce a new x-coordinate, and it may do something else with respect to the u and v value of this vector to produce a y-coordinate. So this is tx and ty are, you know, in general different things. Different things. Such a warp function t is called separable if it can be decomposed into a transformation that is first only applied to the if we first produce the new x-coordinate, once we have that, we apply another transformation to produce the new y-coordinate. Again, this is actually something that is easier seen in terms of equations, like here. So basically, this is, mathematically speaking, this transformation t is separable if we can understand. So this very general form may not be separable. But if this transformation that produces the new y-coordinate can be written as a transformation applied to the x transform and the v coordinate. If this is the case, then this transformation T is separable. And basically, what that is to say is that if we are given a two-dimensional coordinate vector, and we first apply the transformation along the x direction, that would produce a vector where this u has now been transformed into a coordinate x, but the v is a constant or an invariant of this transformation. And then, given this vector, we now apply a transformation applied to this and this coordinate. And this produces the vector we are interested in the end. This is the case, then this transformation is separable. Now, how do we know if something is separable? Well, this is just if it is partially invertible. Let me see if I have details here. Yeah, if we know that we can solve for u, I actually want to go to here. So, in order for this general transformation T to be separable, the transformation along, say, the x, or the transformation that produces the new x coordinate, has to be invertible. Because if it is, we can solve for u, and we can use that to transform in the y direction. But this is probably is too much detail anyway. I claim that the mapping that turns this quadrilateral into that one is separable. And yeah, well, we already talked about this, or I encouraged you to verify that at home. See that so far, I always said that this length is to this length, what this length is to that length, which allows us to compute the xa. With respect to the other line here, it allows us to compute the xb, and we can then compute the x. But just as well, we may have sort of first considered this length with respect to that one, which would allow us to compute this point here. And then we could have considered this length with respect to that one to compute this point, and then determine the x sort of from the other direction. Right. I guess I have that all very mathematically here. So this is basically the idea that we first compute xa and xb, and then determine x. But, and if we write it down in the extensive form we have seen earlier, so we basically end up with this equation that produces the x. And now we can apply a lot of algebra to this equation. So what I am doing here is, see, I guess I'm factoring out the u. This looks very much as if I'm factoring out the u. There is another term that has a factor of u. So this is all contained in the square brackets here. There's another term with v, and then there's this constant. And we can therefore also determine this x with respect to u. Look at this here, it was basically an equation in v involving xb and xa. And here it's an equation in u involving xd and xc. Go through it. This is indeed exactly the same. It's just algebraic rearrangement of those terms. That is to say, again, it doesn't matter if we sort of first consider a displacement along the x direction and then along the y direction, or first consider displacement along the y and then along the x direction. And this is, this is exactly what I say here. If we want to compute such a bilinear transformation between two quadrilaterals, we may first map only the u coordinate of this point in the one quadrilateral to its new coordinate, and then we may subsequently map the v coordinate. And this is great because it opens the door for an interesting technique that is called mesh warping. And mesh warping is the idea of applying warp functions to an image, and not just a single warp function as we have done so far, but many of them, which, you know, depending on where we are in the image, may vary. So many different warp functions that is locally warp an image. And here is the idea. There is an image, and we can superimpose a grid over this image. These black lines here, I am just showing them, they are not really there, but we can have a data structure that contains this grid. It's basically lots of 2D coordinates of vertices of tiny little, in our case, square tiles superimposed over this image. And we could then begin to move these things around, as I'm showing you here. Nothing has happened with the image. So far, all I did is that I, in this representation, distorted this mesh. There is one mesh, and here's a distorted mesh. Note, however, that for every quadrilateral in this image, there is a quadrilateral in this image. Some of them look really strange now, but we can identify them. Just by moving around the vertices here, I am not changing the fact, I am not introducing new vertices. So this is basically, it keeps this mesh structure invariant. The meshes look different, but here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 6, I guess, meshes, and here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then, you know, it's also 6 meshes in the other direction. So number of meshes remains the same, which is to say that for the mesh, say, in row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, column 1, 2, 3, we have another mesh in row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, column 1, 2, 3. So this mesh here corresponds to this mesh there. This is great because this, of course, allows us to sort of map the content of this mesh such that it would correspond to a quadrilateral like this. Yeah, and this is basically summarizing what I just said. I already said that. So we superimpose sort of virtually. We don't really, like, we do not really create these lines here. They are just there for visualization. But we can come up with a data structure that represents such a mesh grid. We superimpose that over the image, and then we may, you know, move around the vertices of the mesh. And if we do that, we should pay attention to these 3 points. First one is, sometimes I say mesh, sometimes I say lattice is the same, mathematically the same. The corners should stay where they are. So I will not, in the following, displace this point, this one, and this one. And this can, of course, be done. Nobody prevents you from doing it. But in the applications here, I keep them untouched. I also move these kind of vertices that are situated along the image boundaries only along the boundaries. Right? So this one here is not moved over there. Can be done. Here I'm not doing this. And the third one is the really important one. So the first one, that the corners should stay where they are and that the points along the boundaries should stay along the boundaries. It's not really necessary. The third one is that any displacement of these mesh points should preserve the lattice topology. And by that, I mean that we should not move this point over here, because then this edge would intersect with lots of other meshes. And this is something we need to avoid at all costs if we use this idea of mesh warping. Right? The first two, well, yeah, it's not really so important. but the topology has to remain the same. That is, once again, if you distort this mesh, as I've shown you here, the result still has to look like a mesh, and there shouldn't be any intersections of lines whatsoever. So don't move this one over here and this one over here, you know, then it is not a quadrilateral mesh anymore. So that must be avoided. And if we consider these two meshes, this is the original one, this is the distorted one, then what I did is I mapped the original image first along, I warped it along the rows of the image. Looks slightly distorted already, and then I computed the corresponding distortions with respect to the columns. So basically this is the original image with this regular quadrilateral lattice, and this is the image that would result from mapping all the quadrilaterals in here to the quadrilaterals in here to this distorted mesh. Looks like this. Very much distorted. So this is definitely a warped version of the original image. Yeah, and then I actually okay, so it's funny because actually when I prepared the slides and I went over this because I figured out a nicer way of typesetting Python programs here, and so I had to redo all my slides, which forced me to basically create this slide anew. I've had it for years and years, and now I made a new version out of it, and I didn't understand my program anymore. So this is funny. And therefore, you may not understand it just right away, right? But this is indeed how you could do this. And there is a lot of details hidden in certain function names which I am not providing here. Right? But the general structure can be recognized. We have two steps. And the first one is to compute the distortion along, say, the x-axis. And the second one is to compute the distortion along the y-axis. And both two steps look extremely similar, and indeed both two steps do basically the same, and the only difference is that the role of rows and columns is switched. So here I'm doing something to the column coordinates and keep the row coordinates intact, and here I'm doing something to the row coordinates and keep the column coordinates intact. Now, what we see here, so basically we therefore just have to discuss one of the steps. The other one is really sort of a mirror symmetry, or actually a point symmetry. Flip the role of rows and columns. There's an iteration over all the rows, right? And then there is a loop over the number of vertices of the mesh. Grid points x, so all these grid points have x and y coordinates, and here is a loop over the x coordinates of the mesh. And here I'm looping over the y coordinates, and the reason why I'm doing this is, and this is better shown here. So we are currently interested in say warping this line here. And the first thing we have to figure out is, say we are at, I don't know, first thing we have to figure out is, for this line, where is the corresponding, where do the vertical lines intersect the line we want to warp? Right? By defining this mesh and then distorting these points, we end up with these distorted vertical lines, and for every row we are trying to warp, we first have to figure out, okay, in this row, well, the first one is easy, intersects here, but where does this line segment intersect the row we are currently dealing with? And where does this line segment intersect? Oh, it doesn't even actually, you know. So we have to figure out these intersection points. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm computing the intersection points. And once we have computed the intersection points, we can then just sort of map intervals onto other intervals. So this is what this interpol function does. And this provides us with a new u coordinate. And then we have to do this resampling that is in the current row. We are in the row we are currently processing. We have now determined where the current coordinate has to get its intensity value from. That might be a non-integer coordinate, and so we have to apply interpolation in this original image. This is what I am doing here, and since I don't even provide, I don't know, the definition of the grids here, I figured out this is this slide is actually horrible. I should probably, it might be even better not to show the code than to show it on this level. But anyway, there you go. And because I had difficulties figuring out what I did here myself, I provide you this. I am not going. I will definitely not read all of this, but this is a summary, this one, and I guess there's one more, yeah. So there's a 3-slide textual summary of what this piece of code does. Right? I already summarized it. The first thing we need to do is to figure out where do these mesh lines intersect the line we are currently dealing with. And then we can actually, now we have sort of two boundaries of a one-dimensional interval, and we can therefore map this interval in the new image to the interval in the other image. And by doing this mapping, we have to apply interpolation again. Yeah, there you go. And here is a beautiful application of that. In the example we have studied so far, the mesh that I superimposed over the original image, over the asterisk image, was a very regular mesh. Right? It was this regular lattice. It was just, you know, square tiles. But nobody said it has to be that way. I can basically, I don't know how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, this is a 6x6 lattice. But nobody tells me that I would have to place the lattice coordinate at regularly spaced points. We can, of course, do it such that the vertices of these lattice patches coincide with certain locations in the image that have a meaning to us. Right? For instance, the corners of my mouth. I could place a vertex here and one there, and maybe one exactly in the middle. I could place vertices on the centers of my eyes. Right? And this is actually what I did here. I have, and again, of course, those white lines are not really there if you compute this warp, but there is a data structure, an array, that contains all these coordinates. And I have determined these coordinates, again, by, you know, loading this image in an image viewer, moving the mouse here, determined the coordinate of the center of my pupils, and set them as the corresponding coordinates in this mesh array. And then I have distorted this mesh. But note that I left quite a few points untouched. So the distortion between this mesh and this mesh is a local one again. Right? In this asterisk image, the two crucial differences are that here is a very regular mesh, and basically every internal mesh coordinate has been randomly moved. This was done randomly. Right? Regular mesh, distortion of every mesh coordinate. Here we have a very irregular mesh and the distortion of only a few coordinates. But the very crucial thing is that this mesh reflects semantics of the image. Right? There are mesh coordinates located at points that to your brains can be interpreted. Oh, this is the center of the eye. This is the left corner of the mouth. You see that, right? And I moved some of them around and computed the warp, and this is what I got. So there you have it. Doing something like that is straightforward. Well, it involves this crazy piece of code, but no, it really is straightforward. If you wrap your head around that, that is no big deal. And actually, for a program, computing this takes fractions of a second. No big deal. Right? But now you know how to create these caricatures, and now you also know, at least in principle, because this is probably the coarsest example possible, right? We all immediately recognize that this image has been tinkered with. But if we would do this much more carefully, and Photoshop allows for doing this very, very carefully, I could have sort of slimmed my face, and if it would have been a picture of my whole body, I could have artificially slimmed myself, I could have increased my muscle size, and so on and so forth. Never, ever in your lives anymore believe any picture you see in any media. I am really, really serious about it. This is laughably stupid, but it shows you how it is done. You can do that on your own now. Of course, you could have used Photoshop all the time anyway, but you know how Photoshop does it. Right? The tools are slightly different, but at the heart there is this. Don't believe any picture you see in any medium. They are all tinkered with. Right? They're all tinkered with. Okay, and now that we understand this is basically the idea of mesh warping. Now that we understand it, we can understand where this idea of morphing comes from. Originally, it was basically just a mesh warping algorithm. So the roots of this famous effect of morphing something into something else has its roots again in mesh warping. And let me first show you an example. So by morphing I mean create a transition from here to there that is smooth. Right? Those are pictures of former colleagues of mine, and this is the picture of the one guy, and this is the picture of the other guy, and then I created, in this simple example, just 3 pictures in between. In reality, you would probably go for 25 pictures in between, because the human eye sees about 25 pictures per second. If I were to create a movie out of that, make sure that every major transition is at least 25 frames in between, because then it looks rather smooth. And here is how that is done. We have the image of one person in this example. It does not have to be applied to face images, obviously it can be done with anything, right? And I am superimposing a semantically motivated mesh over this one. So the corners or the vertices of this mesh correspond to parts of the image that have meaning to us. Eyes, mouth, nose, stuff like that, chin. And I am doing the same with the image of the other person. Right? Those are 2 meshes that I create manually in this case. Can be done automatically. All of this can be done automatically these days. And then there are 3 meshes here and 3 meshes there, and they're actually the same. Probably don't really see that, but once we know this mesh structure and this mesh structure, we can, of course, create, in this case, 3 intermediate meshes where we basically move this point to that point in 3 steps. There is a line from this coordinate, but probably, I'll do it, whatever. There's a line from this coordinate to the corresponding coordinate in the other mesh. And we walk along that line in 3 steps. And that is to say, we move this point in 3 steps from here to there. Right. So we can create intermediate meshes. And then I use the first mesh to create a slightly warped version of that guy. And the second mesh to create a, now it becomes ugly. Third mesh is even uglier. And I do the same. Those, again, 3 meshes are the same. Compute a slightly warped version of this guy, slightly warped version of this guy using the second mesh, and it's a bit ugly mesh using the third mesh here. Now I have 3 intermediate images for this person and 3 intermediate images for that person. And then I just blend them together. So I create a new image that contains 50% of the intensity information from this image and 50% of the intensity information from that image. And in pseudocode, this is it's actually slightly more involved, but no, not really. So we define a grid or mesh in the one image, and we define a grid or mesh in the other image. And we should, choose that the say if this coordinate here in this mesh is centered on an eye, then it should be centered on an eye in this mesh as well. Right, so the 2 meshes should be semantically equivalent. This is what this says. Then we create these interpolated meshes, and this is just sort of the difference between the coordinates in the one mesh and the other, divided by n, number of steps in between, times t. T is the number of steps we want to create. And we use these interpolation meshes to create these warped images of the one person and the warped images of the other person. And here is the blending of the 2 images, image source person and image destination person at time tt. You see that it's not quite what I said, like 50% of this, 50% of that, but it's still a convex combination of the 2. And this is indeed what I did to create this transition. And again, this is rather brutal because it's just 3 steps, but if I would have done it in more images, then it would not add to the explanation. There you have it. This is how you do mesh morphing. And this is just an explanation of what we see in the figure. The important thing is this. You now understand how morphing is done in principle, right? But if you see a morphing effect in practice these days, so I don't know, some fancy commercial or a Hollywood movie, very, very likely the effect you see in that movie is not done using mesh morphing. This is where it comes from. This was the first approach towards morphing. Nowadays there are much more fancier ways of doing that, but they are so fancy. Important thing is you know what it means to do morphing in principle, where it comes from. You could do it yourself, very easy to be done. But if you want to have like really beautiful morphs, then with these meshes, it's probably not such a good idea. There's much more fancier stuff out there. We are not going to discuss that because that was all for today. We now know about perspective mappings. Right? Last time we only talked about bilinear mappings and their properties. We now know about perspective mappings and their properties. Lines will always be lines, but distances are not necessarily preserved. We have seen applications of perspective warping, and the 2 examples were this augmented reality scenario, where I warped an image into a scene such that at least perspectively it made sense, and we also talked about the creation of image mosaics. And we then learned about the fact that bilinear mappings are separable, and that led us to consider applications of separable bilinear warps very fast, can really be done really quickly. And here we looked into the creation of these, in our case, caricatures, but usually it's used to make models slimmer than they really are. And we also saw how to do morphing. That is all for today. Do you have any questions? Well, if not, next time we'll study color. Something else entirely. Next 2 lectures will be on color. And yeah, that's basically, this was all about warping. We had to look into, now you're well equipped for the rest of your life to understand that nothing is to be trusted anymore. It's like that. See you next time. Thanks.